I had a feeling that weekend would change something between us, though I couldn't have said what exactly. Maybe it was the way the air smelled sharper as summer edged into fall, or maybe it was the way Daniel had looked at me across the lab table last Thursday, his mouth curled into that half-smile that always knocked the rhythm out of my chest. Either way, by the time we packed our bags for the trip, I knew I was walking toward a line I couldn't pretend didn't exist anymore. Daniel and I had been partners in research for almost 2 years, colleagues first, friends somewhere in between, and something I couldn't quite name hovering in the spaces we never talked about. He was brilliant in the way that made you want to argue with him just so you could hear him explain why you were wrong. He always wore his sleeves rolled up, always tapped his pen against his notebook when he was deep in thought, and always, without fail, noticed when I was tired before anyone else did. Our department had signed us up for a field assignment, a 3-day trip out near the coast to collect data samples. It was supposed to be routine, early mornings, late nights, equipment laid out in neat rows under the tent's dim light. But nothing ever felt routine with Daniel. Even simple things, like how he tossed me an energy bar without looking, or how his laugh came out rough and low when I made a joke only he would catch, lodged themselves in me heavier than I let myself admit. I told myself I was looking forward to the field work, but the truth was I was looking forward to him. The way his hair curled at the edges when the wind caught it. The way he'd pretend to be annoyed when I messed with his notes, though his grin betrayed him. The way our shoulders would brush when we leaned over the same data sheet, neither of us pulling back right away. As I checked my pack one last time that morning, flashlight, notebook, spare batteries, I caught myself lingering on the thought of Daniel's hand brushing mine when we reached for the same piece of equipment. Too small a thing to matter, too large to ignore. He texted me just then, "Don't be late. I'm not carrying your gear if you forget something again." I smiled at the screen longer than necessary before tucking it into my pocket. This wasn't just another assignment. Something about it, about us, felt like a tide turning. And I wasn't sure if I was ready to let it pull me under, but God, I wanted to. By the time I reached the parking lot, Daniel was already there, leaning against his car like he'd been waiting for hours instead of the 15 minutes I was running late. His arms were crossed, sunglasses perched lazily on his nose, and the first thing he said when I walked up was, "You're predictable, you know that? Predictably charming?" I shot back, slinging my pack into the trunk. "Predictably late," he corrected, but there was a curl at the edge of his mouth, the kind of smile he saved for when he was pretending to be annoyed but really wasn't. This was how it had always been between us. Snappy, playful, full of cracks that meant more affection than they did criticism. From the very first day we'd been paired up in the lab, we'd fallen into this rhythm. Daniel with his meticulous notes and need for precision. Me with my tendency to improvise and tease him out of his rigid focus. Somehow, instead of clashing, we'd balanced each other out. The drive to the coast was long enough for the sun to dip lower and the air to grow cooler. We passed the time the way we always did, trading sarcastic commentary on the awful playlist the radio kept throwing at us, reminiscing about that disastrous experiment last spring when the fume hood nearly caught fire, and arguing about whether coffee or tea was the superior fuel for researchers. "You'd collapse without coffee," Daniel said, glancing at me briefly before returning his eyes to the road. "And you'd collapse without me reminding you to actually eat lunch," I countered. "Face it, we're a package deal." His knuckles tightened slightly on the steering wheel, and for a heartbeat I thought maybe I'd stumbled too close to something real. But then he smirked and shook his head. God help me. We reached the campsite just as the sky turned that bruised shade of purple before nightfall. Setting up the tent was more complicated than either of us wanted to admit. The poles refused to cooperate, and Daniel, usually calm under pressure, was swearing under his breath in a way that made me laugh more than help. "You think you're funny?" he muttered, yanking a stubborn piece into place. "I know I'm funny," I said, reaching around him to hold the fabric steady. My hand brushed against his arm, warm even in the cool evening air, and I felt that jolt I always did, like static electricity, only deeper, sharper. He didn't pull away, and neither did I, not immediately. When the tent finally stood, slightly crooked but functional, Daniel flopped down on the ground and stared up at the sky. "Remind me why we agreed to this instead of the hotel option?" "Because fieldwork builds character," I said, dropping down beside him. "And because you refused to share a queen-sized bed." He turned his head toward me, eyebrow arched above his sunglasses, which he was still wearing despite the lack of sun. "You're insufferable. And yet here you are." There was a pause, the kind that wasn't empty but heavy, filled with something unspoken. I let it linger, savoring the way his gaze held mine for just a little too long before he finally sat up. The first complication of the trip showed itself when we unpacked our gear. Daniel rummaged through his bag and froze. You've got to be kidding me. What? He pulled out his sleeping bag, or rather half of one. The zipper was broken, the lining frayed where it should have been sealed. I swear this was fine last time I used it. I grinned. Guess it's you in the cold, buddy? But he wasn't laughing. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration etched across his face. I softened then, the joke dying in my throat. I've got a double, I said casually, too casually. We can share. Daniel looked at me, really looked as if he was trying to read between the lines of what I'd just offered. My chest tightened under the weight of it. Finally, he smirked, though there was something unreadable in his eyes. Fine, he said. But if you steal the blanket, you're dead. I forced a laugh, but inside all I could think was how the small, stupid mishap had just drawn a line closer between us. A line I wasn't sure either of us knew how to step over. Yet. That night, the wind came in sharp gusts that rattled the walls of our tent, making it sway like it might peel away at any second. I'd crawled into my sleeping bag, trying to arrange myself in a way that wouldn't scream I'm way too aware of you lying beside me, but awareness was inevitable. Daniel was only inches away, his body heat creeping across the small gap between us. You're hogging the blanket already? He murmured into the darkness. I'm literally not, I whispered back. Check your side. There was a rustling sound as he shifted, then a quiet chuckle. Fine. Maybe not. But if I wake up freezing, I'm blaming you. The sound of his voice, low, softened by sleepiness, hit me harder than it should have. I stared at the faint outline of the tent's roof, listening to the rhythm of his breathing. Every movement he made, every shift closer, was amplified in the tight space until I couldn't tell where I ended and where he began. It would have been easier if it stayed that way, just shared space, awkward but manageable. But halfway through the night, the tent lost its battle against the storm. Rain started seeping through tiny seams, dripping onto our gear. One particularly loud crack of thunder shook Daniel awake, and in his fumbling to check the tent flap, he nearly toppled onto me. Sorry, he muttered, bracing his hand against the ground, his palm landing just by my hip. The air left my lungs in a rush. I knew it was an accident, just proximity in a cramped tent, but the warmth of his hand radiated through me all the same. He didn't seem to notice at first, too busy peering out at the sheets of rain. We're stuck, he said finally, sighing as he settled back down. His hand brushed mine before he pulled it away. Guess we just ride it out. Guess so, I whispered, though my mind was anything but calm. I rolled onto my side, away from him, hoping it would give me enough distance to breathe. But Daniel shifted too, following without meaning to, until our backs nearly touched. The thin space between us felt like the most fragile boundary in the world. I could almost imagine leaning back, letting my shoulder rest against his. Almost. Sleep never came easy. My mind spun in circles, replaying every casual touch, every glance that lingered too long. I wanted so badly to believe there was more in those moments than I allowed myself to see. But what if I was wrong? What if this closeness was just closeness and I ruined everything by asking for more? The rain didn't let up the next morning. By the time we'd eaten a rushed breakfast of energy bars, the ground was a swamp of mud and puddles. Our schedule for data collection was effectively ruined. Well, Daniel said, kicking at a muddy patch with the toe of his boot, guess today's a wash. Literally. I tried to smile, but there was a weight in the air that wasn't just the storm. Stuck together in a leaky tent for another day, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, it was a recipe for either disaster or revelation. The hours dragged, filled with half-hearted attempts at card games and reading notes by the dim glow of a lantern. It should have been boring, but with Daniel so close, it was anything but. Every laugh, every brush of his hand against mine as we reached for the deck, every way his knee bumped mine when he shifted, it was all too much and never enough. At one point, he leaned back against the tent wall, stretching his arms overhead with a groan. His shirt lifted slightly, revealing a strip of skin at his waist. I looked away so fast I nearly gave myself whiplash, but not before heat flushed through me, shame mingling with want. You okay? Daniel asked suddenly, his eyes narrowing in that way that always made me feel like he could see right through me. Yeah, I said too quickly. Just restless. He studied me for a second longer, then let it drop. But when he reached for the blanket we'd been sharing, he tugged it around both of us this time instead of just himself. There, he said lightly. Problem solved. It shouldn't have meant anything. It was practical, just warmth, just comfort. But when his shoulder pressed against mine under the shared fabric, the storm outside faded to a dull hum. My chest ached with the effort of holding everything in. For a while neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't empty, it was charged, a fragile thread stretching between us. I wanted to break it, to say something, anything, but fear held me still. Fear of ruining the ease we had, of tipping us into something we couldn't take back. And then Daniel shifted closer, his arm brushing mine as he settled more comfortably under the blanket. He didn't look at me, didn't say a word, but the simple movement sent a shockwave through me. If he noticed how tense I was, he didn't call me out on it. He just sat there, warmth pressed against me as if it was the most natural thing in the world. I wished I could believe it was. The rain finally softened sometime late that evening, but by then the tent felt less like a shelter and more like a cage, one I wasn't sure I wanted to escape. Daniel was still sitting shoulder to shoulder with me under the shared blanket, legs stretched out, head tilted back against the thin canvas wall. He looked tired but not unhappy. Content maybe. Which was more than I could say for myself. Inside I was a mess. Every second dragged me closer to the breaking point. My pulse tripped over itself at the smallest things. The steady rhythm of his breathing, the casual brush of his arm against mine, the way his hair had gone damp and curled from the humidity. All of it was too much. Too close. Too good. And I wanted to say something. God, I wanted to. But every time I opened my mouth, my throat closed up, the words dissolving before I could force them out. What if I was wrong? What if he didn't want this, didn't want me? What if I ruined the only good thing I'd ever had with him? I shifted, restless, and Daniel glanced at me. You're squirming like you've got ants in your sleeping bag, he said, his voice dry but softer than usual. I'm fine, I lied, tugging the blanket tighter around myself. You're not, he said simply, as if he knew better than I did. Which honestly he usually did. That was the thing about Daniel, he noticed. He noticed when I was distracted, when I was hungry, when I was pretending to laugh at something that actually bothered me. And now he noticed this. I let out a breath, staring at my hands. I just have a lot on my mind. Well, we're trapped in a tent with nothing else to do. Might as well share. His tone was teasing, but the way his eyes lingered on me was anything but. I swallowed hard. This was it, the opening I'd wanted and dreaded all at once. My chest tightened, my heart hammering like it was trying to punch its way out. Daniel, my voice cracked and I hated myself for it. What if I said something that changed things between us? Would you hate me for it? He blinked, surprised. Why would I hate you? Because, I said, forcing the words out, sometimes the things you feel aren't the things you're supposed to say out loud. Sometimes you don't want to ruin something good by asking for more. The silence that followed was unbearable. I couldn't even look at him. My stomach twisted, waiting for him to laugh it off, to tell me I was being ridiculous, to remind me of all the reasons this couldn't work. Instead, Daniel shifted closer, his knee pressing firmly against mine. Is that what you've been carrying around? This fear of ruining something? I nodded, my throat too tight for words. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, softly, with me? That made me look up, finally, because his tone wasn't mocking. It was careful, almost fragile. And his eyes, God, his eyes, were steady on mine, wide open in a way I wasn't used to. Yes, I whispered. It was barely audible, but it was the truest thing I'd ever said. Daniel exhaled, long and slow, like he'd been holding his breath for weeks. He raked a hand through his damp hair, then laughed under his breath, not cruelly but in disbelief. You're an idiot. I flinched, but before I could retreat into myself, he leaned closer. You think you're the only one worried about ruining this? I froze. What? His mouth twisted into something halfway between a smile and a grimace. Do you know how many times I've almost said something? Almost? He stopped himself, shook his head. I didn't want to push you. Didn't want to risk everything. So I kept my mouth shut. The world tilted. My heart lurched. You feel it too? He laughed again, softer this time, and the sound was thick with something I couldn't name. I've been trying not to. But yes, of course I do. I didn't realize I was shaking until his hand brushed mine, steadying me. His fingers lingered, warm and certain, and that tiny point of contact broke something open in me. All the fear, the hesitation, the months of silence, it poured out in a rush. I can't stop thinking about you, I confessed, my words tumbling out too fast, too raw. The way you laugh, the way you focus on everything like it's life or death, the way you, God, Daniel, I notice everything. And I keep telling myself to shut it down, to ignore it, but I can't. I don't want to. His thumb grazed the back of my hand, a tentative stroke that made my chest ache. You're not the only one, he said, so quietly it almost disappeared under the sound of rain. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was alive, buzzing with the weight of everything we'd finally put into the open. I searched his face, waiting for hesitation, for retreat. But instead, he shifted closer, closing the last inches between us until I could feel his breath against my cheek. "Can I?" he began, the question unfinished but obvious. "Yes," I said instantly before fear could claw me back. And then he kissed me. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't rushed. It was tentative, almost cautious, like he was testing the waters of something we'd both been drowning in for months. His lips were warm, softer than I imagined, and the touch sent sparks down my spine. I leaned in, greedy for more, and felt his hand slide up to cup the back of my neck. The kiss deepened but never lost its gentleness. It was the kind of kiss that said, "We've been waiting for this and we're not going anywhere now that it's here." When we finally broke apart, our foreheads rested together, breaths mingling in the damp air. I was trembling but not from fear this time. Daniel laughed again, breathless. "We're idiots," he said. "Yeah," I agreed, grinning despite myself. "The worst kind. The oblivious kind." His thumb brushed across my cheek, lingering like he wasn't ready to let go. "So, what now?" I didn't have an answer yet. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Now. We stopped pretending. For a while neither of us moved. The storm had finally quieted outside, leaving only the soft patter of drizzle on the canvas. Inside it was just us, close enough that I could still feel the warmth of his lips, the weight of his hand at my neck. I didn't want to breathe too loudly, didn't want to break whatever spell we just stepped into. Daniel was the first to speak, his voice low and rough. "So, we actually did that." I laughed quietly, pressing my forehead to his shoulder. "We did. And the world didn't explode." "Not yet," he said, a teasing lilt undercutting the seriousness in his eyes when I looked back up. "Give it time." The words made me grin, and that grin, unguarded, unstoppable, felt different. Freer. I hadn't realized how heavy the silence between us had been until it finally broke. Now, sitting here with his fingers brushing idly against my hand, everything felt sharper, more alive. "You know," I said, leaning back slightly so I could see him better, "I spent months convincing myself you'd never feel the same way. That you were just humoring me when you let me get away with all my teasing." He snorted. "Humoring you? You think I let you steal my pens and write nonsense in my margins because I didn't care?" "Exactly." I smirked, then softened. "Turns out you cared too much, huh?" His gaze lingered on me, steady and intense. "Yeah. Way too much." The honesty in his tone sent a shiver through me. For a moment I forgot how to breathe. But then he ruined the intensity in the most Daniel way possible, by nudging me with his shoulder. "Still not forgiving you for that time you drew a mustache on my data sheet though." I laughed, the sound bursting out of me with more ease than I expected. "You loved it." He shook his head, but there was no real bite in it. The teasing, the banter, it was the same as always but underlined now with something new, something steady and certain. We weren't hiding anymore. That changed everything. At some point I shifted closer, and Daniel didn't just let me. He welcomed it, wrapping the blanket tighter around both of us until we were pressed side by side. My head found his shoulder naturally, like it belonged there. He leaned his cheek lightly against my hair. It was so simple. So right. "Have you thought about what happens after this?" I asked softly, though part of me dreaded the answer. Daniel hummed, his chest vibrating against me. "Honestly? I don't know. It's not like our department would care, really. But..." He trailed off, fingers tracing idle circles on the back of my hand. "I guess I was more worried about you. Whether you wanted this, whether it was worth the risk." I tilted my head, meeting his eyes. "It's worth it. Whatever happens, I'd rather have this than spend another year pretending." His lips curved into the faintest smile, softer than any I'd ever seen on him. "Good. Because I'm not sure I could go back even if I tried." That admission settled into me like an anchor. Heavy, grounding, real. We spent the rest of the evening wrapped in that fragile new closeness, testing the edges of it. Sometimes we were quiet, just listening to the rain. Sometimes we talked about stupid things like whether instant coffee counted as a crime against humanity, or serious things like the first time he realized I mattered more to him than I should have. Each word, each laugh, each brush of his fingers against mine felt like stitching a new pattern over something old and worn. At one point I caught myself staring at him, really staring, unguarded, with no reason to hide anymore. He noticed, of course. "What?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Just adjusting to the view," I said, smirking. He groaned, pushing his palm over his face. "God, I regret everything already." But the flush at his ears gave him away, and I grinned, leaning in to kiss the spot just beneath his jaw. His sharp inhale made my chest swell with something I couldn't name except joy. Later, when the lantern dimmed and we lay side by side in the dark, I felt his fingers twine with mine under the blanket. A quiet gesture, simple and certain. "Tomorrow," he murmured, half asleep, "we'll figure it out. Tonight, we just exist. Together." And I thought, for once, that sounded like the easiest promise in the world. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world outside glittering and raw. The air smelled clean, sharp with salt from the nearby coast, and sunlight broke through in fractured beams across the drenched ground. The campsite looked wrecked. Mud everywhere, equipment damp, notebooks warped, but for once I didn't care. Daniel emerged from the tent behind me, hair a wild mess, eyes squinting against the brightness. He stretched, groaning dramatically. "Well, this looks like hell." "You always know how to find the silver lining," I teased, kicking at the mud with my boot. He shot me a sideways glance, and there it was again, that curve at the edge of his mouth, the one that used to undo me in silence. Now I could just let it undo me. We worked together, salvaging what we could. Every so often our hands brushed, small accidental touches, but neither of us pulled back anymore. It was such a subtle thing, but it carried weight. Permission. At one point, while wringing out a soggy blanket, I muttered, "Bet you wish you'd taken the hotel option now." Daniel grinned. "Not a chance." He shook the blanket and sent a spray of water right at me. I yelped, lunging at him, and he laughed, loud, unrestrained, that rare laugh that crinkled his eyes and left me helplessly smiling back. Somehow, soaked and muddy, it felt like the most perfect moment of the trip. Maybe of us. Later, as we packed up what little we could carry dry, I noticed him pause. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, looking out toward the horizon where the ocean glimmered silver in the distance. His expression was softer than usual, thoughtful. "What?" I asked, stepping beside him. He glanced at me, then back at the view. "I was just thinking, how weird it is that everything feels different now. And at the same time nothing does. You're still you. I'm still me. But we're not pretending anymore," I finished quietly. He nodded, his hand brushing against mine again. This time he didn't just linger, he curled his fingers around mine, deliberate, steady. It was such a small gesture, but it felt monumental. I squeezed his hand, unable to hide my smile. "Guess we're a package deal after all." "Guess so," he said, though his voice carried something deeper than the joke. Something certain. The walk back to the car was long and muddy, but I didn't notice the discomfort the way I usually would. His hand never left mine, not once, and every step felt like it was stitching us together in a way that went beyond words. When we finally loaded the last of our gear into the trunk, I leaned against the car door and looked at him. "So," I said, trying to sound casual but failing miserably, "what happens when we're back? Back to labs and deadlines and reality?" Daniel closed the trunk with a soft thud, then turned to face me. His expression was unguarded, open in a way I'd only ever dreamed of. "Then we figure it out," he said simply. "We don't have to have all the answers right now. We just have to keep choosing this." His thumb brushed over my knuckles, grounding me. "Keep choosing each other." The words sank into me, steady and certain, more real than any promise I'd ever heard. I let out a slow breath, my chest loosening in a way it hadn't in months. "Okay," I whispered, smiling. "Then that's what we'll do." He leaned closer, close enough that his forehead touched mine, and for a moment the world shrank down to just us. The warmth of his skin, the softness of his breath, the quiet certainty between us. The storm had passed. And whatever storms might come later, I knew we'd weather them the same way we had here, side by side, stubborn, teasing, holding on tighter when things got rough. This wasn't the end. It wasn't even close. It was the beginning.